Hi, my name is Lourdes Salaman, and on behalf of the Teaching and Learning Lab, I would like to welcome you to TLL Seminar Series. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Greg Walton, whose work has inspired me both personally and professionally. Dr. Walton is an associate professor of psychology at Stanford University. He earned his BA IB in philosophy from Stanford, followed by a PhD in psychology from Yale University. After graduate school, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Waterloo before joining the Stanford faculty in 2008. Dr. Walton has received many awards from numerous organizations, was identified as a rising star by the American Psychological Society in 2011. His research focuses on understanding psychological processes that contribute to social problems and on developing interventions that affect these processes to help people thrive. For example, together with colleagues, Greg Walton developed an intervention to bolster students' feeling of social belonging in the transition to college, which raised the academic achievement of ethnic minority students over 3 years. Dr. Walton's work spans education, health, and intergroup relationships. Besides his work on WISE interventions targeting student belonging, Greg has substantially contributed to other interventions that can increase students' performances, such as growth mindset and value affirmation. Last year, supported by MIT's Manhan and Hart, TLL launched a You Belong initiative at MIT to facilitate the dissemination of research-based practices that increase student sense of belonging and to motivate faculty and staff to design and implement local interventions. We are very pleased to see so many faces and broad representation from the Institute today to continue the discussion on how we can best help all students feel that they belong at MIT both socially and academically. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lourdes, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak with you today about the work that my colleagues and I have done. As a social psychologist, I begin in thinking about problems of belonging and social problems broadly by focusing on what the world looks like from the perspective of a particular person, a person who's in a particular circumstance. And so we begin by asking the question, for example, what does school look like, or what does a classroom look like if you're sitting in the third row, surrounded by your peers, and a professor or a teacher begins to teach. And from this vantage point, an experience that we've all had in various forms, there's a variety of concerns and worries that can come to people's minds. One kind of question that people can ask themselves is, do I belong? Is this an environment in which I'll belong, which people will value me, will respect me, which I'll be able to contribute? Another kind of question that people can ask is, can I do it if the work's hard, if I'm struggling, if I feel very frustrated? Am I reaching the edge of my abilities, or can I overcome those challenges and succeed? The third kind of question that people can ask themselves is, does it matter, especially if it's boring, if it's frustrating? Is there a reason to keep going, a reason to try, a reason to persist? Now, one of the things that's very striking in social psychology in the past 5-10 years is that very specific, precise interventions that address each of these kinds of questions, that help people to answer those questions in ways that are adaptive. Exercises that can last 15 minutes or an hour can, in a number of cases, cause improvements in students' academic outcomes that last months, even years into the future. And when people hear about interventions like these, they often have this reaction. They say, wow, that's magic. And that reaction, that interventions like this are magic, can take a couple of different forms. They're kind of inverses of each other. One form is these are magic tricks. They can't really be real. There's something going on under the surface. And that's a perception that can be disproven through data and additional data. But a second kind of belief about magic is this is the magic bullet we've been waiting for. We've had these problems for so long. We've struggled for so long to create academic environments where people can really grow and succeed, and all people can. This is what we've been waiting for. Let's scale this everywhere immediately without delay. And this response, too, is equally mistaken. The essential thing is to start to understand what it is that these exercises are doing, what are the psychological concerns that people have, how do these exercises contend with that in ways that really allow people to succeed. So that's one of my goals today. Let's take a metaphor. It can seem like an incredible miracle when you're sitting in an object that weighs many, many tons and it lumbers down a freeway and suddenly it lifts off into the air. This is a miracle every time it happens. And when you stop to ask the question, how does an airplane work? There are some features of the system that are obviously essential to its success. Not that they're necessarily easy to achieve, but they're obviously important. So there's got to be somebody who's controlling the thing, making it do things. We'll call that person the pilot. There's also got to be something that's making the thing go forward. We'll call that the engine. That seems important to being able to go up. And then there's this curious thing, the wing. It sure seems like the airplane wouldn't fly if it didn't have a wing. And if you go to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian, you will learn in a fantastic exhibit, really, about the iterative work that the Wright brothers did in essentially laboratory tests in wind tunnels in their bicycle shop in Ohio, and then field tests, iterating that laboratory work with field tests in North Carolina at Kitty Hawk, testing how to shape a wing so as to maximize a force of lift. And these details, they turn out to matter quite a great deal in terms of the performance of an airplane. Now, similarly, when we think about schooling, we think about education, there are obvious features of an education system that are important for them to succeed, for people to learn. So there has to be, at a basic level, opportunities for people to learn. You have to create context and put forward material before people that they have an opportunity to learn from. A child's not going to learn how to spell if they don't get some form of spelling lessons. There's also a kind of basic requirement that people in the system, teachers and other instructors, parents and students, are all kind of motivated for the students to do well. People are kind of disposed for the system to work well. And yet there's also, just like the shape of a wing, there are also less obvious features of a system, of an education system, that are essential to its success. And often these other aspects take the form of psychological processes that can prevent the system from performing, as it were, as it is intended. And those include things like worries about belonging, worries about fixed intelligence, worries about stereotypes. So the student is walking into that classroom persistently wondering, pervasively wondering whether they belong in that setting, whether they're going to be smart enough, whether other people are going to view them through the lens of a negative stereotype. It might be hard to hear that spelling lesson. And what psychological interventions often do is they address those worries so as to clear them out of the way and essentially allow the system to take off as it's designed. Allow the system and allow the people in that system to achieve the potential that they have. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is focus on the first big question that people often ask themselves. That's the question of belonging. Obviously, in many cases, these questions are interweaving for people. They form often a kind of toxic tornado where people think, maybe I don't belong, maybe I can't do it, maybe there's no point, maybe I don't belong. But today we're going to take the vantage point of really focusing on this question of belonging. And when interventions address a question like this, I'm going to call them psychologically wise. And they have a couple of qualities. I'm going to foreshadow this here and come back to this at the end. First of all, these exercises are not programs. They're not like the airplane itself. They're not like a school itself or a spelling lesson itself. They're also not skill building in the traditional ways that we understand skills. They're not trying to make people kind of have better cognitive or non-cognitive skills. Instead, what they fundamentally do is they address subjective meanings or interpretations or narratives or beliefs or mindsets, whatever the word that you want to use is. But the basic point is how people are making sense of themselves and the situation that they're in. For example, in a school setting, how they're making sense of their relationship with that institutional environment that they're belonging in. And these subjective meanings are really important because they have a couple of qualities. One is that they're the most proximate driver of behavior. The most proximate factor that shapes how a person behaves is how they're making sense of themselves in the situation that they're in. A second reason is that these meanings don't just evaporate in the moment. In the course of our actual lives, as we make our way through institutions, they readily become recursive. We often behave in ways that come to reconfirm the meanings that we began with. And in that way, they can cause lasting change. That is, in that way, changing the ways that people make sense of themselves, make sense of social situations, can cause truly lasting change in the course of people's lives. Another reason why they're so important is that they're malleable. And they're malleable often because they take the form of answering the implicit questions that people have before them in a situation. So often, the kind of context that we're in, either the historical context or the immediate context, what you can think of as a kind of socio-cultural context, raises predictable questions that people are going to ask themselves as they enter that environment. Those questions function kind of like interpretive lenses. They shape how people make sense of the environment that they're in. And sometimes those lenses, sometimes those questions or those lenses can be pejorative. They can imply negative things like maybe people like me might not belong there. And what people do then is they try to construct answers to those questions through their experiences, as though they're kind of testing out hypotheses in the world to figure out who they are, what that situation is, how they relate to others in that situation. And then the key for intervention is to try to help people come to the answers that will be adaptive for them and for the social situations and institutions that they belong to. So let's think a little bit together about the social context of college and universities and post-secondary environments in the United States. Let's think a little bit about the kind of basic roots of our beliefs about merit and deservingness. As many of you may know, the first IQ tests were developed in France by Walton, who developed these tests at a period where there were large numbers of kids from rural backgrounds coming into Paris, kids who hadn't had much formal schooling. And the goal of the first IQ test was to figure out where kids were so that the school system that they would go into could be appropriate for them and meet them where they were and help them advance. So the original, Binet famously said, after the illness, the remedy. And the original vision of an IQ test was fundamentally growth-oriented and optimistic about people and their potential. And that view of IQ, of the role of intelligence testing, got completely perverted as it crossed the Atlantic. The early Stanford psychologist Lewis Terman was a person who, maybe more than others, was responsible for the transformation of IQ in the American mind. In addition to his focus on intelligence testing, he was a eugenicist. The quote I'm going to give you is a hard one. It's a hard one for us to hear today, but I think it's very important because I think the ideas that Terman advocated are ones that echo in some forms today. So Terman writes here in 1916, the measurement of intelligence. He's talking about kids with low IQ scores. Children of this group should be segregated in special classes and be given instruction, which is concrete and practical. They cannot master, but they can often be made efficient workers, able to look out for themselves. There is no possibility at present of convincing society that they should not be allowed to reproduce, although from the eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusually prolific breeding. And I don't know about you, but that freaks me out. I hear that, I presented this before, this is not new to me, but it gives me the willies, it is a disgusting, ugh. And one of the reasons I have that visceral response is because that is not in the past. There are echoes of those views in ways people think, in institutional practices that we inherited, in the ways that people make assumptions about others today. Now, of course, it's not just a view about intelligence. There's also a profound role of group identities and the positions of people in our society to contend with schooling. Of course, we fought in this country a long and hard fight for school desegregation. And school desegregation, the movement for school desegregation, can be seen in part as an insistence upon the right for all people to be able to belong in schooling, in all sorts of schooling circumstances. Now, I write here school desegregation and resegregation because our schools today are as segregated as they were in the early 1970s. We reached the pinnacle of our school desegregation in the 1980s and have been retreating ever since. So we have in our society a long history of people from minority backgrounds fighting for the right to be included and to belong within mainstream educational settings. We also have in our society attendant stereotypes about the abilities of different people. Stereotypes that we are all aware of, even as we may reject those stereotypes. This is a kind of graphic depiction of stereotype threat that a woman might experience in a math and science setting, having a conversation with a man. The man might think they're talking about the substance, and the woman might think that he might be viewing her through the lens of a negative stereotype. There's research with faculty, for example, math and science faculty, showing that the more men talk with other men about research, the better they feel. The more women, faculty, in math and science, talk with men about research, the worse they feel, the less enthusiastic they feel about their work. Claude Steele, a colleague at Stanford, developed the notion of stereotype threat, and he writes, he defines stereotype threat as a psychological burden caused by the concern that one's performance or behavior might seem to confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. For all of us, when we walk into settings where a negative stereotype about our group applies, we can worry, we can wonder whether other people will view us in light of that stereotype. And that's a trivializing and demeaning and threatening prospect in many circumstances. So contexts raise questions. They raise questions about belonging. One way to think about a question like this in a post-secondary context is people can ask themselves, am I the kind of person who, at a fundamental level, can go to college and succeed in America? Can I do this? Can people like me do this? And we see echoes of this question in stories told by many, many people, including many people we all admire a great deal. Here is Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, a first-generation Latina kid who went to Princeton. And she writes in her memoir, at Princeton, I felt like a visitor landing in an alien land. I spent my years since Princeton, while at law school, and in my various professional jobs, not feeling completely a part of the worlds I inhabit. It's not a feeling that went away as she became more and more successful. It's a feeling that stayed with her, this feeling of unsettledness, this feeling of not being sure that she was really a part of all of the worlds that she was entering, even as she was extraordinarily successful in her career. Notably, Sotomayor, as a wise Latina, famously in her confirmation hearings, has used her jurisprudence, her background and her experience to inform her jurisprudence. Here she's writing in the Fisher case on affirmative action in dissent. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce that most crippling of thoughts, I do not belong here. We also see these experiences in another student. I'm not trying to pick on Princeton here, but this is another graduate of Princeton. And this student writes in the mid-1980s, my experiences at Princeton have made me far more aware of my blackness than ever before, no matter how liberal and open-minded some of my white professors and classmates try to be toward me. I sometimes feel like a visitor on campus as if I really don't belong. It often seems as if to them I'll always be black first and a student second. Now, this is a striking quote, again, because she's writing at the end of her time at Princeton. She's not writing as a freshman, she's writing as a senior in her senior thesis. She's at an institution that you would see has every resource available to it to support students. And it's also a striking quote because this, again, is somebody who we all, I think, admire a great deal. This is our former First Lady, writing as Michelle Robinson in 1985. So contexts raise questions. They raise questions, and among the most important of these questions is this a place where I can belong? And people start to construct answers to those questions, and they start to construct answers to those questions sometimes even from the cues that from an outside perspective would seem the most trivial and most minor of events. So here again is Michelle, and here is a picture of her from college. And here she is at a White House event, and she's going to share a bit about her experience as she very first moved into her dorm room at Princeton. She says in 2014, when I first arrived at school as a first-gen college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't even bring the right size sheets for my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long. So I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. It's amazing, right? Here she is, the First Lady of the United States, one of the most admired public figures in the country. And she remembers the fact that when she came to college, she didn't know that the beds were extra long, and she didn't bring the right size sheets. And she remembers the differenceness that felt to her, that spoke to her. She's trying to figure out, she's remembering how she tried to figure out whether she could belong in this environment. She's remembering this event that happened so long ago. So Jeff Cohen and I developed the term belonging and uncertainty to try to capture this idea. And the idea is that for all of us, when we walk into settings where our group, for all of us, when we walk into new settings, when we get a new job, when you go to a new school, all of us will ask the question, is this a place where I belong, where people value and respect me? But when we go into settings where our group is underrepresented, or our group is negatively stereotyped, that sense of uncertainty about belonging, that unsettledness, the asking and the re-asking of the question is just all the more pervasive. And what that does psychologically is that it gives you a lens for interpreting events. So when things happen, it gives you a way to make sense of those things. And so if you have something bad happen to you, if you get criticized, if you feel lonely, if you feel to make a friend that you want to make a friend with, if your professor yells at you, it can seem not just like a negative event unto itself, but it might seem like confirmation of the fears that you have, confirmation that maybe people like you, people like you, might not belong in that environment. And that inference, that sense that you don't belong, especially at an institution that you value, that you strive to attend, that's a really toxic and harmful problem. So one way to engage with this is to start to think about these high-level beliefs that people have, and the implicit beliefs that people have, and that they use to make sense of many different events that happen in the world. Try to shift those in ways that help them interpret the array of things that are happening in ways that become more adaptive. So the social belonging intervention developed as an effort to do this. And what it does is it tries to get people out of a mindset where they're thinking of belonging as a kind of yes-no proposition, where they're interrogating their experience with the question in mind, do I belong or not? Yes or no, yes or no, or yes or no. And instead, help them make sense of their belonging as a process of growth. Not asking, do I belong or not, but how can I develop my belonging? What are the communities I can belong to? What are the relationships that I can develop in a place? To know, to assume that it can be difficult at first to belong, that people typically don't belong at first, but that can get better with time. The intervention, that basic idea, is conveyed in very straightforward ways through stories that people hear, or people read, stories from older students who've gone through a transition before them. And what those stories do is they all convey that representation. They do so from different perspectives with different particular experiences, but they all convey that basic truth. I felt people described how they felt like they didn't belong at first, and it got better with time. Now, the intervention is not delivered in a way that makes people feel like they're receiving intervention or that they're receiving help. Instead, we tell people that we want their help in creating materials for future students the next year, and we would like them to write their own stories about how this process of change and development has been true for them, so that we can use their materials, their stories, sometimes their videos, sometimes their letters, with future students coming in the next year. That way students can view themselves as benefactors, not beneficiaries. They take an active role. They're not merely passively receiving the content. And they connect the abstract content that they're reading about to the particular content of their own lives. That is, in a sense, there's an active effort in the design of the intervention to release control of the intervention to the recipients, to allow the recipients to own the ideas, because ultimately they have to do that for the exercise to be effective. Now, in the original test of this, conducted at a selected college, this was a particular study that was focused on African American and white students. We looked at students' GPA over time. The intervention was delivered in the spring term of students' first year in a 1 hour long exercise in the laboratory. And what you see is that for African American students who did not receive the treatment, they show effectively a kind of slight dip towards the middle of their college careers, a slight increase towards the end, but basically what you're seeing is a more or less a flat line, which is really basically unacceptable, right? These students are taking classes with students from all class years, and they're not showing the kind of term-by-term growth that you would want to see as an institution. By contrast, those who got the intervention do show that term-by-term growth, as though every term they're gaining more resources, more supports, more relationships, more habits that help support higher levels of achievement. For white students, you see slow increases over time in GPA as well. Now, Because this is, so over this 3-year period, the intervention reduces the black-white achievement gap by 52%. Because it's really an effect on the trajectory, it's really an effect on the growth pattern, the reduction senior year is larger, it's about 80%. In addition, because this intervention is addressing something that's profoundly important to people, like their sense of belonging at their college, it has an array of other consequences, including people reporting being healthier, going to the doctor less, and people are reporting being happier. African American students are reporting with better health and greater happiness at the end of college. Okay, so how does this work? Here's an example that helps to illustrate this. After the intervention, we did daily diary experiences. Every day people told us what happened to them. This is a black woman who was in our control commission. One day she told us, everyone is going out without me, and they didn't consider me in making their plans. At times like this, I feel like I don't belong here, and that I'm alienated. When we looked systematically, the intervention had no effect on the first sentence here. There were, in fact, no race differences and no condition differences in the kinds of adversities that people were reporting to us or their severity. What the intervention did, though, was it cut off this negative inference. It prevented people from taking an experience of adversity and then concluding that they didn't belong in general, in a global way, at that institution. So it doesn't make people's lives just a bed of roses, but it prevented the particular challenges that they face from having a broader symbolic meaning. And when we look statistically, that change in social construal, in the meaning of the events that people are experiencing, mediates the 3-year gain in academic performance. Now, clearly that's an inadequate explanation because there's a whole lot of things happening in between the first week after the intervention and their freshman year of college and their gains in GPA over 3 years. So now that we've collected a whole lot more data, we can construct a model more like this, where what you see is that the confluence of being in a group that is negatively stereotyped or stigmatized within the context, the confluence of that group identity and experiences of challenges or setbacks or threats can create the interpretation, maybe people like me don't belong, can't fit in, can't succeed, that leads to people to withdraw from the academic environment, to be less likely to email the professor for help, to be less likely to reach out to other students to form a study group. And ultimately that undermines achievement in college outcomes. The intervention seeds this belief that these kinds of challenges are normal and it's normal to worry about whether you belong and it gets better with time. It then facilitates that interpretation of specific events that happen, and that helps people sustain their academic engagement, their social and academic engagement in the context. Okay. So that study is one that we have subsequently followed those participants since, because of course college life doesn't end at college graduation, and we wanted to see how people were faring as they went off into their lives. This is a collaboration with these folks led by Shannon Brady here, who's an incoming faculty member at Wake Forest University now. What we did was we worked very hard to resurvey these participants 7 to 9 years after they participated, 3 to 5 years after college. So they're now young adults. We, at the end of the day, we're mailing people checks for $50 and just saying, please, while you're cashing the check, could you fill out our survey? Among the big outcomes that we looked at were people's satisfaction and success in their careers. So how successful did they view themselves as being? Of course, people at this stage in life, many people are in graduate school or in professional school, so financial outcomes are not a particularly relevant outcome. We focus more on these reports. And what you see is that for both white and black students, but particularly for African Americans, they report greater satisfaction and success in their careers in the treatment commission. And when you look as well at a measure of psychological well-being, in some cases, there are instances of interventions that help African Americans or help people from lower social class backgrounds succeed in careers, but at a cost to health or at a cost to well-being, and that was definitively not the case here. So African Americans are also reporting being more satisfied with their lives, being less stressed, and being happier. Then we asked the question, well, what is producing that? And the first thing that we looked at, the first thing that you might think about is maybe it was those better grades they got in college. And no, grades were not even predictive. They didn't even correlate with career satisfaction and success and life satisfaction 3 to 5 years after college. They were not even correlated. Instead, we found that it seemed to be the kind of mentor relationships that people develop. So we asked people this question: when you were an undergrad, did anyone associated with the school other than fellow undergrads with a special interest in you and your academic development? And what you see is that African Americans are more likely to report having developed a mentor in college. And moreover, they were more likely to report that that mentorship continued after college. You can see here 37% versus 4%. And statistically, a measure of that mentorship mediates those life gains. So what you have here is an intervention that addresses a psychological worry early in college. People's persistent worries grounded in their social identities and the position of their identities in a post-secondary context. A persistent worry about belonging. The intervention addresses that worry, and it essentially allows people then to reach out and build mentor relationships and presumably other kinds of relationships that are important for later success in life. I'm going to give you a little more granularity of what this looks like. So here are some stories some of our participants said. One person says, I wouldn't say I received any mentorship, not for lack of interest in professors, but I didn't really seek it. Another one says, the first semester of my freshman year was very difficult for me. I was struggling academically, didn't feel like I fit in. I was unhappy with my major. I began to spend more time speaking with my freshman counselor. We really bonded, and she helped me to realize that I didn't belong. Thanks to her, I was able to connect better with my peers and perform better academically. And I love this part. We've kept in touch ever since. This last one is rather hysterical. I had a very deep relationship with my senior thesis advisor. One summer, while I was doing an internship in Greece in a field related to my studies, my mentor came to visit me all the way from the United States. Given his old age, how much he cared. He always took an interest in how I'm balancing academia and athletics and took an effort to get to know me personally. And you can start to see how the development of these relationships might be made more difficult if people are persistently worried about their belonging. And yet how that development can be important for success going forward in life for a young person. Now, those interventions were relatively small-scale interventions. So one of the things that we have worked to do now is to try to develop ways we can reach students at a larger scale. And we realized that one way to do that would be, instead of reaching people while they're already enrolled in college, would be to help give people, to try to give people adaptive theories for making sense of challenges in college before they even come to college, before they've even gone through the college board. So this is a kind of pre-matriculation version of an intervention where we're asking the question, can we give people helpful theories about challenges in college in advance of them actually coming to college? And a reason why we care is because this is a way that institutions can reach entire cohorts of students. Institutions routinely ask incoming students to upload a picture of their ID card, to fill out a paragraph with their advisor, to do other sorts of things prior to matriculation. And we thought maybe we could create an online version of this exercise that could be embedded in a process like that. Originally we tested this in 3 separate contexts that we simultaneously had the opportunity to pursue. Students who were graduating from urban charter schools, almost all minority first-generation students serving, largely in Philadelphia and in the Houston area, a large public university, and a selective private university. I'm going to focus on the third here, just because it's most that came to MIT. This particular trial was one that involved a large collaboration of people, and we were able to work with 90% of the incoming students at this school. We identified in advance groups of students who were disadvantaged on campus, and in part that's defined by the presence of existing achievement gaps in GPA. These were African American students, Latino students, Native American students who are a small population but showed the largest numeric achievement gap and of special concern, therefore, and particularly white first-generation students. At this institution, Asian first-generation students were doing just fine. They saw a link on the orientation website, and they were directed to an online survey. There was a control condition, and then there were 3 intervention conditions where they heard stories, and then they wrote a letter about that content. The materials look a little bit like this. Social and academic life at Stanford. What's it like to come to Stanford? You're in, you're coming, you're excited. You probably have lots of questions about what to expect. And here's an overview of the 3 basic intervention ideas that we were trying to convey. They're all related, and they're all related to belonging, but they all have a little bit of a different form. So one is the social belonging intervention that I emphasized earlier. So everyone worries at first, but whether they belong over time to feel at home. A second is based on research showing that that people from ethnic minority and first-generation backgrounds tend to have what Hazel Marcus would call a more interdependent sense of self, a sense of self that's defined by relationships with others in larger part. Whereas college in America has an extreme kind of independent focus. Be all who you can be. Be the person, you choose your own adventure from your majors. Design your own major. Make your own choices. Become an independent person. And so we emphasized in the stories that students can maintain interdependent ties with people back home, and they can join independent communities at college, even as they're also participating in the independent cultural world of college. And then the third was a critical feedback intervention that was focused more narrowly on the question of what does it mean when people give you critical feedback, and convey the idea that instructors tend to give critical feedback because they have high standards and they think that students can reach them. I'm going to come back to this psychology in a little bit later. The primary outcome was first-year GPA that we looked at. And for Asian and white continuing gen students, there is no difference between the 2 conditions, and you can see their GPAs are already quite high. If you look at the prior 2 years historical data for students from the broad disadvantaged category, you see there's a large GPA gap, or I'd say a moderately large GPA gap. This here we're looking at raw means. And our control condition reproduced essentially that gap. All 3 of the treatments increased GPA for students from this disadvantaged background. When we look instead at first-year GPA controlling for high school class rank, SAT, ACT scores, or gender, you see the GPA gap shrink, but essentially the same condition difference. First-year GPA is one thing, but perhaps more important is given the mentor data that I shared, is the degree to which people are really becoming embedded so here's the reduction that she made, becoming embedded in the social world of the university. So at the end of the first year, we surveyed students, and we asked people a variety of things, but we were particularly interested in questions that assessed their integration in the social and academic worlds of college. So we asked people, how much have you made close friends? And here, looking just at that disadvantaged group, you see people are reporting more close friendship development in the treatment condition. How involved are you in extracurricular activities? People report being more involved. How much have you used academic support services, like meeting with a professor or TA after class, going to a writing center? Again, we see greater use. And how have you developed a mentor relationship yet in college? And you see, again, the greater mentor outcome. Now, this is at the end of students' first year, but we have since, and these graphs are going to be unclear because they're very new. We have since surveyed students as they exited college and asked them a broader range of measures. I'm just going to share them with you so you can sort of see the breadth of effects that can emerge. One question that we were interested in was the degree to which people experience college as meaningful and purposeful, kind of eudaimonic well-being. And what you see here is that for students in the disadvantaged category, there's they report lower levels of meaning and purpose as compared to the advantaged students that the treatment remedies that. We asked people the mentor question, and here at this point at the end of college, what you see is that all students are not at 100%, but they're at 75% or so, except for men from the disadvantaged backgrounds. So here we're looking at Black men, Latino men, Native men, white first-gen men, and only 48% of those in the control condition report having developed a mentor, and that goes up in the treatment. So there's the intersectionality there. We also explored further questions about health. So this is data reported to us by the health center. How many days do people visit the health center? And you see that there's in the control condition, the disadvantaged students are going to the health center about 4 more times over their college careers, and that's reduced in the treatment. Oh, sorry. I thought I had one more graph in this. And what that, if you look at that as a histogram, what you really see is that the tail is getting pulled in. That fewer students in the disadvantaged category are going to the health center a whole lot. Now, another trial that we did was focused not so much on race and class, but on gender, because in STEM there are persistent stereotypes and underrepresentation of women in math, science, engineering, and technology context, and I wanted to share that with this team here. This was a study conducted at the University of Waterloo, which is, as they love to tell me when I was up there, the MIT of the North. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but that's what I got told. What we did in going to this context was to first begin with a very intensive efforts at understanding the concept by talking with senior women engineering students. So we conducted extensive focus groups and interviews with women who've been in the program for a while to really try to identify the themes that they reported to us that they experienced as threatening to their belonging. We ultimately found a couple themes that were particularly important that informed the revision of the intervention. So one was that women often reported feeling excluded from male peer groups, and they reported this in often in social kinds of contexts. So women reported feeling like they were treated as not one of the guys in a way that felt exclusive to them and felt comfortable to them. So what we did in the intervention was to tell a story in which we validated that experience, but we also tried to bound it. We tried to prevent it from seeming representative, symbolic of not belonging in engineering as a whole. So we told a story in which a woman described men having, this is Canada, right? So men having a conversation about hockey, how she didn't know anything about hockey, how she felt alienated in that conversation, but then had the conversation turn to a TV show. It was a popular at the time engineering TV show called Monster Machines, and how they all bonded over the different episodes. And she realized, that she writes in the story, that even though she didn't share their love of hockey, they all were interested in how things work, and that's why they were all engineers. So we wanted to validate the experience that we knew that people were having, but also show a way that it didn't have to mean that you didn't belong in engineering. A second was that women reported experiencing sexist disrespect in a variety of ways and contexts, in ways, in fact, that were more explicit and overt than what we had heard from African American students, and strikingly. Students described making a classy women in engineering calendar, having a professor make a sexist remark about it, and then having a female professor tell them not to present themselves as women first if they wanted to be taken seriously as engineers. So we thought long and hard about how to deal with this, because we didn't want to just ignore it, and we also didn't want to do something that might validate the perception of sexism on campus. And what we ultimately chose to do was to tell a story about an experience of disrespect, but that could appear, were to come from a woman, as sexist disrespect, but to tell that story from a man's perspective, and then to seed an alternative interpretation, an alternative possibility for that. So we had a male student describe going to the professor and asking a question, having the professor treat him like he thought he was dumb, and then the student saying that he ultimately came to realize that the professor just wasn't a very good teacher, he didn't know how to explain things well, learning to go to a TA, learning things from the TA. And the goal was just to seed in, for women, the possibility that those kinds of experiences could have to do with like other deficiencies, like deficiencies in teaching. It was a kind of indirect strategy. Here's the primary outcomes of people's GPA in the first year. And what you see, first of all, looking at majors that are more gender diverse, that have about, on average, a third women. There's no inequality, there's no gender difference, and there's no treatment effect. This is a Canadian grading scale where about 80 gets you honors and about 60 means you may get kicked out of the program. If you look at men in the more male-dominated majors, here 9 out of 10 students are male. Men are still doing well. Women in the control condition are not, and the treatment eliminates that inequality in the first year achievement. We also saw evidence that was really encouraging for that the treatment seemed to help women become more integrated within the environment that they were attending school. So here we're looking at women's reports about their friendship groups, what percentage of their friends are in these different categories, and what you see is that in the control condition, Only about 44% of women's friends are other male engineers. And remember, these are in male-dominated majors where 90% of their peers are men. That number increased to 75% in the treatment condition, allowing their friendship networks to more reflect the kinds of people that they were actually interacting with, to be more part of that community. Okay, so this work has led us to create the College Transition Collaborative, which is really a large group of researchers led by Christine Vogel, Mary Murphy, myself, David Yeager, Chris Smith, who is our executive director, and a large team of researchers working with partners around the United States. A great range of different kinds of institutions, both very selected elite institutions and open access, broad access institutions, to try to convey adaptive messages about belonging to students enter college, and then doing so on a randomized basis to evaluate effects on core outcomes like retention and ultimately graduation rates. It's a large program that has our PERT Center at Stanford, which supports a lot of the back-end technical work to make this possible, and it's funded by a number of foundations, and it gives us the potential to reach tens of thousands of students across the country to evaluate interventions as we do so. Now that approach is an approach that emphasizes the high-level beliefs that students have as they enter an environment like college, like their beliefs about their belonging in general, and tries to shift those beliefs so that you can shift how they make sense of particular kinds of adversities that come up. But an alternative approach, a complementary approach, and one that's also very important, is to identify particular events that are likely to happen to people and that will predictably give rise to threatening needs for students. And then to think about how those events, those particular events get represented and how you can shift those representations to help people do better. So a classic example of this, one that we should all be familiar with, is what does it feel like when somebody gives you really tough critical feedback? So you sit down, you write your paper, you produce your problem set, whatever it might be, you turn it in to the expert, your instructor, and then they rip it apart. This is an essay the students in 7th grade wrote about their heroes. This particular student chose to write about Martin Luther King, and you can see all this red content on the page. And if you are a recipient of this, you're in a complicated position, because on the one hand, you could think, this is among the most valuable resources that there exist for improving my work. This is an expert who's motivated, who's taken the time to give me specific critical feedback about what I didn't do well, how I can get better. That might be one interpretation. Another interpretation might be more like that. That latter interpretation, a version of that latter interpretation, might be especially available if you're receiving critical feedback across some kind of group lines that's defined by stereotypes. So if you're a woman in math and science, you're getting criticized by your male TA. If you're a black student, you're getting criticized by a white teacher. Then additional kinds of questions are reasonable to ask, like, is this person biased? Does this person think that I just confirmed this stereotype? Does this person think that people like me can't do this? And those are additional concerns that are above and beyond the other concerns that anybody might have in that circumstance that can cause you difficulty in responding to that feedback. So David Yeager and Valerie Purdue-Mons and Jeff Cohen and colleagues did a little study, a very illustrative and important study in a 7th grade context, where they took essays that students had written like this, and then they intersected those essays before they went back, after teachers had marked them up, and before they went back to the students, and they pinned with a paper clip a note onto those essays. And what they tried to do with this note was to disambiguate the reasons why the teacher was giving the harsh feedback. And so the critical note, what's called the wise feedback note, said, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. It's not because I think you're dumb. It's not because I don't think you can do it. It's not because I'm stereotyped. It's because I have high standards and I think that you can meet them. Very simple. There was also a control condition where the note said, I'm giving you these comments so you have feedback on your essay. Very useful. And the first question in this research was, all right, so these kids then have the opportunity to revise their work for a higher grade. So the teacher's labored hard, she's given this critical feedback. Is the student going to take back up to produce a new version of the essay for a higher grade? And if you look, first of all, at the control condition, the answer was like a mixed lot. Only 62% of white students took up that opportunity, and pathetic, like a terrible, only 17% of the black students chose to do this. And you can, well, imagine if you're a teacher and you worked hard, you stayed up late on Saturday night to give this feedback, and then you get this kind of response from your students, you can imagine how frustrating that might be. In the wise feedback condition, though, it went up to 87% for white students and 72% for black students, a far greater effect. And that increase was largely driven, for black students, was largely driven by those black students who entered the study mistrusting of their teacher, for whom the relationship with the teacher was most at risk. Now, I emphasize in talking about the belonging intervention the idea that the ways that we make sense of the world don't just stay in some kind of place, like in our mind, that they can become recursive, they can become, lead to long-lasting changes in people's lives. And this study, this particular single instance of getting a disambiguation of the reason why an instructor is giving you critical feedback illustrates how a change in meaning at the right time can produce really lasting change. How a meaning can become fixed like clay when it gets baked into the structure of people's lives. So let's see what this means. So here, this was not the end of the study. This is just what people did in the first week after the exercise. The researchers then tracked students over the next 2 years, and they found that for those black students who were most mistrustful of school, that wise feedback halted a decline in school trust over that 2-year period, through 7th grade and into 8th grade. So having one instance where it was clear why a teacher was giving you critical feedback halted an otherwise normative decline in the trust that students had for their teachers. And as it's preventing that erosion of trust in middle school, it's having behavioral consequences. So black students who got the wise feedback note received fewer disciplinary citations, half as many disciplinary citations the next year in 8th grade. And then, at the end of high school, they were more likely to enroll on time in a 4-year college, that is 6 years after the original event. That original perception of the reason why a teacher might be criticizing you, as shaped by the wise feedback note, became encapsulated in their lives, both in the trust that they felt towards their teachers, the likelihood that they got involved in disciplinary problems with teachers, and ultimately their enrollment in college 6 years later. Now I want to turn back to college and another acute instance of a time when people may predictably feel like maybe they don't belong. And this is the context of academic probation, and again, a large team of collaborators. These are our university collaborators, Rob, Herstein, and Lourdes Andrade. This project particularly began as administrators came to us with a problem, as Rob and Lourdes came to us. And what they said was that it's not that we have that many kids who get placed on probation, but they don't get off probation, and we don't understand why. We have all these resources, they're talented students, why don't they get off probation? Only a quarter of them get off probation at the earliest opportunity. How could that be? So we started to learn more about this problem, and we started to learn about the purposes of probation. One purpose was a kind of due notice purpose. The lawyers wanted to be able to give people due notice in case the institution wanted to kick people out. But that wasn't really the reason why the institution is sending probation notices to people. Really, from Lourdes' perspective and from Rob's perspective, we're trying to alert students to challenges and alert them to resources that are available to them to help meet those challenges. So it's intended to be helpful for students. But then we asked, okay, well, what about students? How do they experience academic probation? So we, through our partners, we surveyed several hundred students who got placed on academic probation. And we just began with a simple question. We said, tell me your probation story. What happened? Why did it happen? How did it go? And we got we produced then, we pulled out the affect-related words that people told us and organized that here in this word cloud. And what you see is a whole lot of negative words, some very negative words. It's not exclusively negative. You can see helpful and productive here. But there's this is a very negative experience for people. We then looked at some of the stories that people actually shared. And here you can see you get a tenor of this. So I felt like a failure when I got my probation. I felt incredibly alone. No one seems to struggle, at least not to that degree. I felt like I couldn't tell anyone. It sucked. I lied so many times. I felt I didn't belong. I already felt that way coming in, but the letter seemed to confirm that. For a minute, I wanted to drop out. People were not exclusively negative. People also told some positive. Here, being put on probation, so that wasn't one of the positives. But there were some positives. So here's that illustrate the potential for the process to go better for students. So here, somebody says, I met some great people. I'm thankful that the school is a strong safety net, catch students who are struggling, whatever the reason. I appreciate all the advisors who care. I could not have finished my degree without all of you. As a way to illustrate just how negative these were, we also put them through online software that gives you a kind of emotional valence score and compared it to other things. Student stories about academic probation were more negative. Lower is more negative. They were more negative than the perhaps paradigmatic story of shame in American literature. They were slightly more negative than King Lear, but they didn't quite reach the lowness of the saddest country songs of all time. So, when we saw this, we thought, what's happening, this is like the most negative academic experience of people's lives. The institution that they value, that they care about, is, in their view, effectively telling them that maybe they aren't worthy, maybe they don't belong at this place. And so then we asked the question, can we revise very intentionally the way that the institution communicates with students about what probation is and how they're seen to prevent some of that negativity, to make that more balanced. And the first thing we did was to frame probation as a process, not a label. We saw people talking about the scarlet letter. We thought about the scarlet letter. And in fact, the standard letter the institution was sending capitalized the P. We got rid of the capital P. And we always referred to probation as a process, or the process for academic probation. It's not an identity, it's something that's a process that you're going to go through. Then we were very explicit to communicate, you're not the only one. You're not alone in this. You should also know that you are not alone in experiencing these difficulties. Then third, we conveyed why it was in the institution's mind that the student was having difficulty. So the original letter had said whatever difficulties you might have, and students, administrators thought well, that was really good. They loved that section. But what students thought was that whatever difficulties was like this, whatever difficulties, whatever your problem is. So students felt very judged. They felt it very pejorative. So we were just more explicit. We said there are many reasons to enter the academic probation process. It can include personal, financial, health, family, or other issues. Like things that don't make you a bad and unworthy person. And then we offer hope for returning to good standing by working with their advisors. Many students on probation leave the process and continue a successful career at this school. And we didn't just convey this from administrators, we also told stories from students that illustrated the lived experience of this. So here is a student, Michael, who says, when I failed an important math class, I was devastated. If anything, getting probation was worse. Thought I was the only one having a hard time. Eventually, I got the courage to talk to my RA. He told me, you'd be surprised how many times I've had this conversation. Every time a person walks in thinking they're the only one, but really, lots of students struggle. I learned something important in the process, how to face up to challenges, to reach out to others for help, to find a way forward. So first we tested this. So let me just highlight some things about this approach. This approach is not tough love. We heard on the committee people talking about tough love. It's not tough love, but it's also not a kind of downplaying or vague or avoidant. It's not kind of kitty gloves either. Instead, what it is it's psychologically clear. It's clear about what probation means to the institution and how the institution views the student and its ongoing relationship with the student. Just as the letter is clear legally for DUET purposes and clear administratively for the purpose of getting students to enroll, for example, in any required probation classes. It's clear psychologically about what probation means to the institution and how it sees the student. The first thing we did to test this was to do essentially scenario experiments with students, undergraduates, asked to imagine themselves receiving a letter, placing them on probation. Each letter was populated with their own first name. So it said, dear, your own first name, and then the letter proceeded. It was very vivid for students. And what you see is that at an elite university between subjects and at an elite university within subjects where people saw both letters, The revised letter led to lower levels of shame, lower levels of stigma, and less concern about dropping out. And these results basically replicated at a state university. The within-subject study also allowed us to ask participants which letter do you think administration should send, and about 80% of them said the revised letter. So then we did that on a randomized basis. We used a cohort of students and we randomized them to get the original letter or the revised letter. The first outcome that we looked at was, did people reach out to an advisor, particularly in person, within a few weeks after getting the letter, as both letters ask people to do. And if you're feeling ashamed, if you feel like you're sinking into the floor, that's not exactly a feeling that's going to lead you to make a meeting with your advisor. And so you see here in the standard condition, 40% of people didn't contact an advisor in that period, 43% visited in person, and that moved in the treatment condition. So only 20% were so negligent in the treatment condition, and 68% actually didn't. Next, we asked a year later, what do the academic outcomes look like? And you see in the standard condition, half of students had proceeded to a more severe, like a suspension status. Replicating what we had heard from our administrator partners, only about a quarter had gotten off probation. And then that again moved, so that in the treatment condition, only 20% were on that more severe status, and 43% had gotten off probation. We also cut the data another way. There's another way to cut the data, which is to just ask, are people still enrolled in the institution as opposed to having discontinued or having been suspended? And if you cut the data this way, you see 79% are still enrolled in treatment conditions compared to 48% in control condition. That then led the institution to roll this out for all future students, and in fact, this letter, the revised letter, is the standard for all students. There's a very interesting and important postscript to this story, which is that upon seeing the data I showed you about reaching out to an advisor, the institution said, what are we doing? Like, we're sending people the most horrible letter from the school that they've ever received, and then sitting on our haunches waiting for them to contact us? Like, that's like malpractice. And so they, to their credit, said, we're going to do that. We're going to take that over. So they initiated a process where they did that reach out. They called students. They organized those meetings. And I think that's terrific, because that's the institution taking ownership of that process in response to its understanding of the psychological experience of its students. And it also totally interferes with our randomized controlled trial, right? Because it's taking away that mechanism as a potential treatment effect. And it's also even potentially conveying the more adaptive, growth-oriented, less shamed representation of probation. So we continued to randomize the letter, but the institutional policies had changed as we proceeded through additional cohorts. Here's the data I showed you before. Off probation, still enrolled. In that first cohort, you see 43% got off probation, 78% were still enrolled. And if you look at cohorts 2 to 5, they basically look like the treatment condition in cohort 1, as though the circumstance for everybody had improved. Now, obviously, this is it'll be important to do future research to understand more clearly the academic consequences of reducing the shame and stigma that people feel when they're being placed on probation. I would just note that no institution wants to be in the business of making its students feel ashamed and stigmatized, regardless of the academic outcomes. It's still a good thing to do. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up here by trying to draw some broader lessons for how we think about problems and how we think about solving problems, what I call psychologically wise interventions. These interventions, as I suggested earlier, are not programs, and they're also not nudges. They're not changes to a situation that's simply designed to make a given choice or behavior easier or more likely. They're also not non-cognitive skill building. We're not trying to build people's, for example, executive functioning. But they address subjective meanings, also known as construals, interpretations, inferences, mindsets, beliefs, attributions, and narrative. Lots of words, and none of them is really quite perfect. So usually I just use the word meaning, how people make sense of things, themselves, other people, and social situations. Now note that these other approaches, programs and nudges, are what you might call situation-centric. They are designed to address seemingly objective features of the environment, of the social situation, and shift those to make it easier to have better outcomes. A non-cognitive skill building approach, in contrast, is what you might think of as a kind of person-centric approach, where you understand the cause of poor problems as a deficiency within the person, like a lack of executive functioning skills, and you try to develop ways to help them build those skills inside of them. Instead, what we are thinking about when we think about subjective meanings is both the person and the situation. It's how does the person make sense of the situation and of themselves, given the sociocultural context that they're in. So it attributes problems then to both persons and situations, not just to the kind of inherent qualities of the person or the inherent qualities of the situation. And these subjective meanings are so important, as I said earlier, because they drive behavior, because they often function as working hypotheses or psychological questions, and so they're malleable at key times and can give people answers to those questions that are more adaptive, because they readily become recursive, because behaviors can reconfirm meanings and then drive lasting change. These meanings come about. People don't just make this stuff up. People don't just make up stuff like, I'm worried about whether people like me can belong in college. They don't just make that up on their own. Those come from the realities that we live in and from the histories that we live in. So they come from the world, the personal experiences, the information, ideas that exist in our context, and they come from the perspectives that we have on those contexts and the contingencies that we each face as we enter those contexts with the given perspective, often identity that we have. Psychologically wise interventions then try to understand these questions that people are bringing to a situation, and then the better we can understand those questions, the more nuanced, the more specific, the more clearly we can understand those questions, the more effectively we can redirect people's inferences, their interpretations, in ways that are adaptive for them and for institutions. So Kurt Lewin is one of my heroes. Kurt Lewin is the founder of social psychology. He was also at MIT for many years in the middle part of the 20th century. He was a German Jew who left Germany in the 30s. One of the many, many wise things that he said, this is a less quoted quote is in social management as in medicine, there are no patent pendings. In each case demands careful diagnosis. When people are making sense of things, we have to understand how it is that they're making sense of things in that context. And that might be similar to, or that might be different from other contexts. So there's a need then for basic research and a need for what we might think of as design research to understand what given meanings arise in a context, what are the particular forms and qualities. If that meaning or that process is maladaptive, how could it be changed effectively, and what might be the consequences of doing so? This paper recently came out in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the Social Psychology Journal, and it's a striking, amazing paper. And I'm just going to highlight this simple point that they draw for the abstract here. They conducted 25 experiments, a new record, which showed that although a large majority of people thought that asking people to take another person's perspective would increase how accurately people understand others, how accurately people understand other people's emotions or their preferences, they fail to find any consistent evidence that it actually is so. But if you just ask people to take somebody's perspective, or you urge them to take people's perspective, people can't then intuit what that other person thinks or feels. What works? Instead, a final experiment confirmed that getting another person's perspective directly through conversation increased accuracy. Increasing interpersonal accuracy is to require gaining new information about and utilizing existing knowledge by another person. So if you really want to understand what the world looks like to somebody who's not you, somebody who's different from you, it helps to ask them. But we don't do that enough. Okay, so to conclude, these social meanings, the ways that people are making sense of things, are often inherently ambiguous, but they're really profoundly important. They can be corrupted or made pejorative by negative sociocultural contexts and histories, and when they do, those psychological processes can mediate inequality. It can be in part through how people are making sense of things and making sense of the world that we can reproduce the inequalities that persist in our society. When we intervene, we can clarify meanings in adaptive ways. Those changes in meanings can change people's relationships and their lives. And when that works, it's really a form of engine oil. It's not the engine. It's clearing out these psychological barriers that can otherwise prevent systems and people from performing as well as they could. And that way, this approach to intervention is one that complements more traditional approaches that focus on structural reforms and opportunities. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.